Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on a Saturday afternoon. I'm 𝗜ጵ𝗱𝗂𝘀𝗁𝗂𝘁𝗍, Manager of Adult Programs here at the Dallas Museum of Art, and I'm so excited to welcome you to our lecture, Industrious Daughters and Miserable Maidens, Lacemaking in Early Modern Flanders, as part of the DMA's current exhibition, Saints, Sinners, Lovers, and Fools, 300 Years of Flemish Masterworks. The exhibition was organized by the Denver Art Museum and the 𝗘𝗍𝗂𝘀𝘂 Foundation in Antwerp, Belgium, and Saints and Sinners presents more than 130 works of art from the Foundation's rich collection of Flemish works that illustrate the remarkable advances in art production and, of course, lace production that took place in Flanders from the 15th to the 17th century. And now I'd like to introduce you all to our speaker, Elena Kanagy-Loux, collection specialist at the Antonio Ratti Textile Center at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who will speak to you on 16th and 17th century European portraiture in which elaborate lace bursts forth from the collars and cuffs of the nobility, such as the Peter Paul Rubens portrait of the Archduke Albert of Austria, and my personal favorite, the portrait of a young woman by an unknown artist. Kanagy-Loux is a descendant of the Amish and grew up between the US and Japan, where she was immersed in both traditional Mennonite craft and the DIY fashion scene in Tokyo's Harajuku neighborhood. After receiving her BFA in Textile Design from FIT, she won a grant that funded a 4-month trip to study lace making across Europe in 2015. Upon returning to New York, she co-founded the Brooklyn Lace Guild, an organization dedicated to the preservation of lace making, and began teaching bobbin lace classes at the Textile Arts Center. In 2018, she completed her MA in Costume Studies at NYU, where she based her thesis on interviews with lace makers that she conducted on her European travels. Now please join me in welcoming Elena Kanagy-Loux.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Christina, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to the Dallas Museum of Art for having me today. It's very exciting to be here. So I want to begin by sharing a little bit more about myself. I'm really a maker first and a historian second, as making lace is foundational to my historical research. So my journey into lace started about 11 years ago when I started looking for a bobbin lace teacher. At that point, I was a weaver, knitter, crocheter, embroiderer, spinner, you name it, I wanted to try it. And bobbin lace was on my list, but I couldn't find a teacher. So I ended up in 𝗜ጵ𝗱𝗂𝘀𝘁𝗂𝘀, Slovenia, for their 2012 Lace Festival, where I took my first class in bobbin lace, and I was hooked. So subsequently, as Christina mentioned, I won a grant to study lace making for 4 months across from Eastern to Western Europe, which was really transformative, and now I have dedicated my life to it. So that being said, I just wanted to share some of my work as well, that because I'm a big fan of lace collars, and we'll be talking about them a lot today, here's a few things that I've made that also happen to be lace collars. So in 2018, I was commissioned by the Columbia Law School to create a bobbin lace collar for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg to commemorate her 25th anniversary of her investiture to the Supreme Court, which you can see I designed and created on the left there with little 25s around it. That's actually now in the collection of Columbia Law School and will be exhibited at the Jewish Museum at some time in the future. Not exactly sure yet when, but it's coming. And then my second major commission was last year. I created a lace collar for the exhibition Threads of Power, Lace from the Textile Museum St. Gallen at the Bard Graduate Center Gallery in New York City. And this I based off a piece in the collection, which is the story of a piece of needle lace depicting the story of Judith and Holofernes from Venice, dating to about 1600. So my piece is a red collar that when worn also tells the story in 5 scallops. But on to the main subject of the day, Flemish lace. As with most historical textiles, it's difficult to pinpoint the precise origin of lace, or to say with complete certainty which country first innovated the core techniques of lace making. Like many other lace regions, Flanders has its own mythical story to explain the origins of lace that of 𝗬𝗂𝗓 of Bruges. 𝗬𝗓𝗓 of Bruges was a young woman in the late Middle Ages who had lost her father at sea, and with him the family's income. 𝗬𝗓𝗓 vowed to the Virgin Mary that she would renounce her fiancé Arnold, an apprentice sculptor, if she could find the means to support her family. While walking in the fields with Arnold, gossamer threads of spider webs began to descend from the sky, some say from the distaff of Mary herself, and created a lacy pattern on 𝗬𝗓𝗓's black apron. Inspired, she took the apron home, and using bobbins made for her by Arnold, she created an ethereal new textile which was immediately in demand by the women in the city and brought her great wealth. Sadly, she had vowed not to marry Arnold in exchange for the Virgin's help, and it was not until a year later, when she was again walking in the fields, that more spider's threads fell from the sky and formed the message, "I release you from your vow," on her apron. Very convenient. Thus, she and Arnold were wed and had many daughters who learned to make lace, establishing the industry in Flanders. Not quite. The reality, of course, is much more nebulous. As far as textiles go, lace is unusual because it's really an umbrella term for a variety of techniques that are used to create aesthetically similar openwork textiles, but that are structurally very different. So my definition of lace, I use a very broad definition, is just a textile in which the pattern is defined by the spaces between the threads. So I'm focusing really on bobbin and needle lace for this talk, but there are other techniques that I'm not including. And although this talk focuses on Flemish lace between 1550 and 1750, lace grew into a truly global enterprise, and to cover all types of lace or lace regions in one lecture would be impossible. So, the two primary techniques to make lace are with bobbins and with a needle, the former of which is my area of specialization, as I mentioned, as well as that of Flanders. Both techniques arguably developed in northern Italy, particularly around Venice, in the first decades of the 16th century, seemingly as part of a zeitgeist of openwork textiles that were growing in popularity at the time, including macrame and lacis. Flanders was also an important part of the lace trade from its very earliest days, concentrated in Antwerp. Needle lace, which you see depicted here, developed from cutwork and drawnwork embroidery, wherein the pattern is marked onto plain weave linen fabric and threads are cut and pulled out of the design, after which the voided areas are embellished with buttonhole stitches. And you can see an in-progress example of this on the top right here. You can imagine that in a time period when just to create, jumping ahead, just to create plain weave linen fabric, you are growing fields of flax, then you are harvesting, retting, possibly dew-retting over weeks or months, hackling, and then spinning, and then dressing a loom with linen threads, and then weaving, just to get to the fabric that you're then going to cut up and throw away pieces of. It's quite wasteful. So due to this process of discarding so much of this precious linen, eventually the base fabric was done away with entirely, and the stitches were worked directly on a parchment pattern, which could be secured to a firm pillow, as you see on the bottom here. After heavier threads were couched around the pattern motifs, the filling stitches were worked back and forth in rows between the outlines without piercing the parchment base. When the pattern is completed, you can turn the lace over and remove the couching threads, or remove the lace by snipping away the couching threads from the back. So one of the earliest forms of needle lace was known as punto in aria, or stitches in air in Italian, because the stitches are literally worked into the air rather than through fabric. So this collar is a great depiction of this transition from embroidery to cutwork to needle lace. So you can see the interior portion that's plain weave linen has some whitework embroidery decorations with a little bit of holes, but not really cutwork of the kind we're discussing. And then the sort of geometric border around it is cut and drawn work that is known as reticella, which is a sort of transitional needle lace between embroidery and true freeform needle lace. So that has the warp and weft threads remaining, and those squares are being stitched back into with the little circles, decorative motifs. And then the scallops that are going all the way around the outside of the collar are in true detached needle lace. So that would be punto in aria. In contrast to needle lace, bobbin lace developed out of multi-strand braiding techniques related to passementerie, which, if you think about like the gold braids on the edges of military uniforms or maybe a very fancy couch decoration, those types of elaborate braids are passementerie. And these became increasingly complex until it was necessary to wind the individual threads onto bobbins to keep them organized. So it's really just, the bobbins are for thread management, essentially. Pairs of cylindrical bobbins, typically made of wood or bone, but sometimes lead, are hung onto pins on a firm base and moved over each other, either in the cross direction, which is left over right, or the twist direction, which is right over left, to create an endless variety of patterns. So if you've heard a lacemaker say that lace is just 2 stitches, bobbin laces, that's really the foundation. So you can do lots of things just with that. The Dutch word for lace is kant, which also means side or edge, because lace first appeared on the side or edge of linen. The two techniques, needle and bobbin lace, developed seemingly in tandem, and over time, the techniques competed with one another to remain the most fashionable lace, which led them to imitate one another and makes them difficult to distinguish at times. The development of lace coincided with the new availability of printed pattern books, if you think to the 15th century and the invention of the Gutenberg press, which were widely circulated across Europe and included many designs for elaborate cutwork and needle lace that were touted as popular hobbies for noblewomen. As Adrian Points put it in 1591, these works belong chiefly to gentlewomen for to pass away their time in virtuous exercises. Called modellari in Italian, these books were authored by the famous engravers of their time and often offer technical instructions and practical information to make the laces. The patterns could have been copied onto fabric or onto a parchment base by putting a candle underneath the working table, or by pouncing, in which the outline of the pattern is pricked with pins and willow coal or white lead is spread over it, which embroiderers still use today. Although multiple needle lace pattern books exist from much earlier in the 16th century, the earliest known bobbin lace pattern book is 𝗏𝗶𝗶𝗃𝗏, the first of which was published in Venice in 1557 by the Sessa brothers. So we know the publisher's name, but we don't always know the names of the actual lace designer. The next bobbin lace sample book or pattern book to be published was New Model Book, which you see on the left here. It was designed by a Swiss woman known only by her initials, RM, who indicated that Venetians had introduced bobbin lace to Switzerland in 1536. Unlike 𝗏𝗶𝗶𝗃𝗏, her patterns include the number of pairs needed to create the patterns, and also includes one of the first depictions of bobbin lace making right here on the frontispiece with the large pillow and bobbins. Right here. Patterns for embroidery and needle lace were much more numerous and appeared decades earlier than patterns for bobbin lace in 1527. I would argue that one reason is because needle lace and embroidery, which are stitched with a single thread, are much less challenging to illustrate in a diagram than bobbin lace, which is created with an increasing number of pairs of threads that have to be accounted for as they travel throughout the pattern, like a circuit board. The only named female lace designer, as RM, the Swiss woman, is only known by her initials, so the only one whose identity is known is Isabella Cattanea Parasole, whose elaborate patterns for cutwork lace is pictured here, and was prolific in designing and engraving patterns for needlework over her lifetime. She did design a few patterns for bobbin lace as well, but some of them reveal a lack of deep understanding of bobbin lace structures, as certain motifs can't actually be executed with bobbins. So it's possible that designers shied away from this technique, which can be slightly intimidating to diagram. Alternatively, some historians speculate that this came down to the tastes of the aristocratic and wealthy ladies that the pattern books were intended for, many of whom preferred needlework as a way to display their elegant hands, whereas bobbin lace is worked with sort of fist-like gestures, so it's kind of less attractive. As you will see, professional bobbin lace was being made at a very high level by the time Parasole's pattern books were published, and perhaps the most innovative bobbin lace techniques were simply trade secrets, but we don't know. Curiously, although Flanders was home to a thriving publishing business in 16th century Antwerp, there are no Flemish pattern books for lace in early modern period. Most came from Italy, Germany, and Switzerland. The Plantin family, pictured here, were a major force in both printed books and the lace trade in 16th century Flanders, and their archives are a major source of knowledge about the period. Christophe and Johanna Plantin were a French couple that moved to Antwerp and opened a shop selling books, lace, and linens around 1548 or 49. Their daughters, Martine and Catherine Plantin, who are pictured here, were involved in running the lace business from a young age, and Martine began managing the lace shop in 1564 when she was about 15. Their records are numerous, and Martine's diary records impressive business dealings as she oversaw 35 workers by age 15. The girls also served as intermediaries to international merchants, including trade with Parisian lingère, or lace and linen dealer, Pierre Gasson, who supplied linens to the French royal family. By the 1570s, their sales with Pierre were over 12,000 florins a year. By the mid-16th century, lacemaking had become a professional industry that required special training, and Pierre Gasson placed his own niece, Jeanne Classart, in a boarding school in Mechlin, where she learned reading, writing, and lacemaking. It was a school for elite girls to become professionals. Notably, lacemakers across Europe were never allowed to organize themselves into professional guild systems that employed and protected male artisans. Instead, the lace industry represents a very early example of capitalist business structures, in which the wealthy invested capital and several intermediaries contracted and subcontracted the work to women and girls who were mostly illiterate and saw little of the profits that were raked in by merchants. Despite the inequity, lacemaking still provided a more comfortable and better paying alternative to agricultural work and domestic service, and by March 1590, the city of Ghent in Flanders issued an ordinance against lacemaking as an occupation to ensure that there were enough maids for wealthy households. Only girls under age 12 could continue to make lace, and young women were ordered to report the nature of their work, their name and address to the city of Ghent within a week to ensure that it was authorized. These samples from the Plantin family archive were exhibited at the Plantin Moretus Museum in 2021 as part of the citywide exhibition project Places, the first of its kind to examine the important role of lacemaking in Antwerp. Although a small amount of fashionable Venetian lace was imported into Antwerp, most of the lace trade involved exporting Flemish bobbin lace from Antwerp, Brussels, and Mechlin internationally to the courts of Europe. Due to its durability, most of what survives from this time is white linen lace, but black silk lace was also quite fashionable at times. However, given the nature of black dyes, many of which used iron as the main ingredient, black silk lace tends to disintegrate rapidly and very few examples survive. Under Spanish rule, Flanders also exported large quantities of slightly coarser laces to the Americas, like the examples seen on the lower left. Martine and Catherine Plantin regularly interfaced with the Beguines, religious laywomen who lived in informal communal dwellings and were able to live and work independently, often working in the textile trade. The sisters traveled from Antwerp to Mechlin to supervise the lacemakers at the town's beguinage, which in the 1560s was known for their embroidered nets, and later became known for very elaborate bobbin lace. Amazingly, a few names of the Beguines survive in their records, such as Dingen Verriet and Tanneken Vertangen, although little is known about the organization of their work, whether the Beguines were making lace in their own workshop or outsourcing it to workers in their homes, or both. In the Brussels City Archives, there are 73 paper patterns belonging to the Beguine Barbara Marcorder, an expert lacemaker who achieved success as a pattern designer. So this could be a great area of entrepreneurship for some women. Depictions of lacemakers in domestic settings were a popular genre in the 16th century, particularly a favorite of Dutch painters like Nicolaas Maes. This depiction of a woman working at home with a baby does not reflect the reality of the professionalized large-scale lace industry, but instead represents an idealized image of feminine virtue. This is not to say that simple lace edgings were not made in the home for domestic use, as they certainly were, but rather that the massive scale of lace production in Flanders, which is represented in thousands of portraits depicting lace and tens of thousands of objects or more that have survived in museum collections, not to mention those that didn't survive, would not have been possible through a cottage industry alone. The reality is that all but the wealthiest aristocratic women and girls worked to earn money for most of history. Oops. One more detail. I'm also including a close-up detail of the lace pillow here, which is a special type with carved wood details on the back that you can see, that is now associated with the Netherlandish village of 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. You can also see the tiny drawer that was common in Northern European lace pillows to hold extra thread and other tools. The finished lace has been rolled up and carefully protected in the square pouch that you can see pinned to the top of the pillow. It's coming off the back there. And those were also often dyed a deep navy blue to keep the lace bright white. Although Flanders' northern neighbors, the Netherlands, were known for their skill in linen production, a major lace industry never really took off there. Most of the records of lace made in the Netherlands in the 17th century describe bobbin lace as one of the many skills taught by linen seamstresses and made in orphanages, workrooms, and spin houses or reformatories. The bobbin lace they produced was mostly the coarser sort used in bed linens and intended for the domestic market, like the tablecloth insertion and edging depicted here, which I am guessing were made freehand, meaning in early bobbin lace, you didn't actually use a pattern as the base. You would cover your pillow with checked or striped fabric, and you would use that as a reference while you simply looked at whatever piece of lace you were copying. So you can see, due to the irregularity of the pattern and the simplicity of the design, relatively speaking, of course, that this might be a sort of example of freehand domestic lace. This is also clear in the depictions of Dutch lacemakers who work with 20 or 40 bobbins at most, with which you couldn't make lace more than an inch or so wide. Flemish laces, by comparison, required many hundreds of bobbins for lace only a few inches wide. So what are some more realistic depictions of lacemakers' workshops? There are very few, perhaps because the spaces in which they worked, such as convents and orphanages, were not often accessible to the public. We are lucky to have a few Italian images of lace workshops dating to the 18th century, like the two pictured here. Despite the wealth of traders and merchants like the Planten family, there was still considerable poverty in Flanders and in Antwerp, and numerous charitable institutions were established to train young women and children to earn a respectable living through lacemaking. Some children apprenticed with experienced lacemakers who had workshops out of their homes, beginning at 8 or 9 years old, but others lived in communal schools such as the Maagdenhuis or Maidenhouse in Antwerp, which was founded in the mid-16th century. This painting of, quote, "The Orphan Girls at Work" from 1676 is part of a triptych by Johannes de Maar that was recently restored and is now part of the permanent collection at the Maagdenhuis in Antwerp, which is a museum. The Maagdenhuis was founded by Jan van der Meer, who was concerned with the fate of the, quote, "young and miserable maidens," and started a home for impoverished girls to educate them in reading, writing, and arithmetic, and train them in domestic skills. As lacemaking developed into the most valuable industry in Flanders, other aspects of education dwindled, and lacemaking became the sole focus of the girls' training at the Maagdenhuis, so they didn't really do much else, unfortunately. Here the girls sit in rows at their lace pillows, while desperate parents bring in their daughters to the wealthy regent of the school, whose wife is dressed in expensive needle lace imported from Venice. Although working conditions, this is here. Although working conditions were poor, lacemaking was still preferable to agricultural work because it was done indoors while sitting down. After a period of reform in the 19th century when conditions were slightly improved, the Maagdenhuis eventually closed, and today it is preserved as a museum, which gives us a rare and critical glimpse into the lives of these young lacemakers. Here you can see a lace pillow with work in progress and a large drum used to flatten and smooth the lace after it was made, and the elaborate prickings that the girls would have worked on over here. These are lappets that you would dangle from your hairdo. Typically, young girls and women in schools like these would earn small sums of money until they had enough to pay for a dowry in marriage, or until they were experienced enough to get a job working as a domestic servant in a wealthy household. The average age of marriage for young women and men in early modern Europe was actually in the mid to late 20s, after they had worked or completed an apprenticeship for a decade or more to save money. It was really only the wealthiest aristocratic families that married off their teenage children as a political maneuver. So what kind of lace were these professional girls and women making? And how much were they paid for their work? You've all seen this fantastic image of an unidentified young woman in a massive lace ruff collar in Saints, Sinners, Lovers, and Fools, which was the height of fashion in the late 15th and early 16th century, while the Plantin sisters were busy plying their trade. On the right is a supportasse, or wire underpropper, used to support the heavy pleated ruffs, which could not hold their own weight even when heavily starched. And this one, I will say, actually belongs to Rubens himself. It is in his house museum in Antwerp. His or his wife's, unclear. According to archival records, in 10 weeks during the winter of 1574, Martine Plantin was supplied with a huge quantity of lace that included 190 decorated ruffs. A Brussels-based beguine named 𝗟𝗂𝗴𝗃𝗀𝘀 also provided wide lace ruffs worked in needle lace, indicating that not only bobbin lace was being produced in Flanders. Informations about payments and salaries are unfortunately not recorded, but the Plantin sisters paid an average of 2 florins for an ornate ruff, equal to about a week's work for a proofreader at the family printing press. For context, a single ruff required many yards of lace, which could have taken many weeks or even months to produce, far longer than a week of work. Ruffs are not a fixed structure, but rather were made of lengths of woven linen that could be trimmed with increasingly elaborate lace. Notably, early bobbin lace was much quicker to produce than needle lace, as it was worked with many pairs of threads moving all at once, rather than with individual stitches of a single thread. As a lace maker myself, I wanted to analyze the lace used in the ruff of the young woman in the previous portrait, as it can be tricky to distinguish bobbin from needle during this period, because they're copying each other. This spiky edging on the left might recall back to the reticella scallops that we saw on the earlier collar. But in fact, there are clear indicators that this is depicting bobbin lace. Because, as I've mentioned, bobbin lace is worked in pairs of threads traveling around the pillow and interlacing with each other, there are certain tells to how the threads travel. For example, rather than a closed circle here, the pairs of threads have a clear path in and out of the circle, like this, because it is actually impossible to make a closed circle in bobbin lace. Also, bobbin lace scallops like these were worked in a zigzagging direction. Where's my, there it is. Like this, so you're working down back and forth across the top and then back underneath and then down. So you're working like this, right? In a zigzag. And as you're going, you're leaving pairs in the middle here. But you can see that there's this line, sorry for the shaky dot, that goes around like this. This is because the central pair is going out to the far point of the scallop and then coming back into the interior edge, which is something that you would only need to do in bobbin lace. So in needle lace, you could just have a straight line here that's just a thread that you've laid down on the pattern and couched over with buttonhole stitches. So it wouldn't necessitate doing this. So for comparison, I've also included an early 17th century bobbin lace edging that I myself replicated from a handkerchief in the Met's collection, which has similar thread paths. So I came this way, dropped my threads off, picked them back up as I went back, and the whole thing is worked in zigzags like this. As a historical fashion accessory, ruffs look rather strange to us today, a massive cartwheel, or millstone as they were called, that divides the head from the body. But 16th and 17th century critics thought ruffs were not only bizarre looking, but immoral expressions of vanity. The English clergyman Philip Stubbs described ruffs as, quote, the cartwheels of the devil's chariot of pride, leading the direct way to the dungeon of hell, unquote. He really didn't like them. Although ruffs were a gender-neutral fashion worn by men and women, Stubbs aimed particular scorn at women who wore ruffs, ranting in his 1583 treatise against modern decadence, Anatomy of Abuses, that, quote, women use great ruffs of Holland, lawn, cambric, and such cloth, in which the greatest thread shall not be so big as the finest hair there is. They are either clogged with gold, silver, or silk lace of stately price, wrought all over with needlework, speckled and sparkled here and there with the sun, the stars, and many other antiquities strange to behold. Sometimes they are pinned up to their ears. Sometimes they are suffered to hang over their shoulders, like windmill sails fluttering in the wind, and thus everyone pleaseth herself with her foolish devices, unquote. Rough laundries, where the great collars were set into figure eights, were caricatured as inhabited by demonic and foolish figures, such as this engraving by Martin de Vos. Notably, Martin's depiction of a lacemaker in his series, The Seven Agents of Man, has a much gentler treatment than the vain women who might have worn the lace she produced. However, he seems confused by the setup of bobbin lace, as the bobbins are hanging off the back of the pillow when they should be in the front. This is not uncommon. It looks confusing. Here's another amusing satirical engraving of a rough laundress's shop where monkeys wear, set, and deliver elaborate collars. It would be right at home in Saints, Sinners, Lovers, and Fools. Despite their vitriol, these critical screeds and satirical engravings are actually a great source of information for historians into how roughs were made and cared for. Stubbs himself has a pretty thorough depiction of the process of goffering a ruff, or ironing it into figure eights with the tool you see here, and setting it with starch, writing, quote, "Lest they should fall down, they are smeared and starched in the devil's liquor, I mean starch. After that, dried with great diligence, streaked, patted, and rubbed very nicely, and so applied to their goodly necks, and withal underproper with supportasses, as I told you before, the stately arches of pride." So he actually breaks down the process for us, that they would wet them with starch first, and then they would, like this woman is doing here with her goffering iron, you heat, this portion is removable, and you can heat it in the fire, and then you put it into this device here, which warms up but not hot enough to burn the linen, and then you can like wrap your linen around it, and you can create figure eights, and you basically pin them as you go and let them dry that way. So that's how you goffer a ruff. Ruffs could be made of single, double, or even triple layers of pleated linen, pressed around the heated cylindrical goffering iron as you see depicted in this painting. For reference, a conservator at the Textile Museum St. Gallen in Switzerland set a piece of historical lace measuring about 4 feet long into a life-size millstone ruff. As you can see, this is reduced to a tiny wedge. So these were truly extravagant accessories for the very wealthy and not, as has been rumored, meant to protect your clothing from food stains or fleas. Given their status, ruffs are common in royal portraits from the time period, including in the portrait of the Archduke Albert that is in Saints, Sinners, Lovers, and Fools, which is a pendant pair with a portrait of his wife, Isabella, believed to be by Rubens or his workshop. The Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna has a copy of these portraits by Jacob Jordans, not sure, that were produced shortly after, and I was curious to compare the lace trims in their ruffs, as they are clearly very distinct. Rubens has a looser hand when it comes to representing lace and is using a nondescript cross-hatching to illustrate the pointed edging here, so it's impossible to identify what kind of lace he's actually depicting. However, in the Jordan's copy, the lace is much clearer. This is not uncommon in duplicate portraits, as successful artists sometimes reference lace in the collection of their own studio rather than copy them from another portrait and thus lose definition. Regardless, it's not clear enough in either version for me to make a call as to whether they are depicting bobbin or needle lace. As for Isabella, her lace in the Rubens portrait is simplified and geometric in comparison to the Jordan's copy, but there is a distinct tell that these are depicting a needle lace technique. Recall the lace on the portrait of a young woman and the traveling paths of the pairs of threads that distinguish it as bobbin lace. Do you remember when I mentioned that bobbin lace could not be used to create a closed circle? Here I will better illustrate what that means. If you look at Isabella's lace on the left, you will see two giveaways that it is needle lace, a closed circular motif, you can see here, and a straight line of thread traveling horizontally across the motif without looping back, like this. For a real-life example, compare these magnified images of lace from the same period. On the right, you see on the left, you see a section of cut work with perpendicular warp and weft threads here and here that are coming out of the woven linen, and that are supplemented with diagonal threads here and here. and a circular motif, a closed circle. Not the neatest, but it's still a closed circle. And this circular motif was created by couching an outline thread onto the pattern base and then working around it in buttonhole stitches. On the right, you see a similar wheel-shaped motif in bobbin lace, but this is the center of a scallop, where you again see the horizontal pair traveling from right to left and then back again down the center. And the circular shape is not closed, but you can see where the pair enters into the circle and then comes back out again, because you can't work a braid back into itself. Albert and Isabella were not only lovers of lace ruffs, but great commissioners and connoisseurs of lace as well. This massive coverlet, which measures 4.5 feet by 4.5 feet, was once believed to have been made for their wedding in 1599, but research by 𝗟𝗰𝗱𝗏, curator of lace at the Royal Museum of Art in Brussels, has determined that it was likely made in their honor sometime between 1616 and 1621, based on the dates of some of the images it depicts. For example, a square depicting Saint Teresa of Avila is clearly referencing an engraving by Antonius Wierix III that was not created until 1614. And another square depicts an Omegang procession in Brussels that took place in 1615. The coverlet is made up of 120 such squares, each measuring about 8 by 8 inches, and depicts over 300 figures, including, of course, Albert and Isabella, along with their initials. And I'm sorry that this isn't a higher resolution image, but there isn't a great one available online, hopefully someday. As part of the citywide exhibition on Antwerp lace that I mentioned, Places, which took place in 2021, the coverlet received extremely in-depth analysis by Ria Corman, Frida Sorber, and Nora Andries, and there is an excellent chapter dedicated to it in the exhibition catalog. British lacemaker and historian Gillian Dye has also dedicated considerable effort to analyzing the coverlet and even reproducing a number of the squares, which you can read about on her blog, listed here. What is fascinating about this coverlet is the incredible skill and innovation that it illustrates in bobbin lace way ahead of its time. Most bobbin lace in this early period was limited to relatively simple geometric continuous patterns with a few crude figural motifs, but the detail on this piece is unlike anything that came before it. According to Corman, Sorber, and Andries, the many lacemakers who worked on this piece were likely referencing line drawings and engravings rather than traditional bobbin lace patterns, and had to literally create and innovate the techniques needed to make it as they went. So it's possible that this coverlet was a major driver in the techniques that eventually established Flanders as the pinnacle of bobbin lace making in Europe. And I just want to point out, because I love it, that he's wearing a ruff. It's just so charming. Lace in lace. There's another example of that later. It's my favorite. All right. As I mentioned, most Flemish bobbin lace produced until the early 17th century, and bobbin lace generally, was relatively simple geometric scallops inspired by Genoese lace, as seen on the left here. But over the century, they became increasingly fine and more elaborate, like on the right. One of the laces which Flanders became famous for is an elaborate scalloped edging named for the painter Anthony van Dyck, who was very skilled in depicting it. As fashions shifted away from stiff, starched ruffs and standing collars, Van Dyck lace was the ideal material for soft draping collars called falling bands, or also called Van Dyck collars. Eventually, the sharp geometric points developed from softer scallops into breathtakingly fine, densely worked patterns with a straight edge, with peony-inspired patterns that evolved into what are now called cauliflower motifs, although that's not the contemporary name for them. This style only came into fashion briefly, possibly because of the densely braided grounds made it so easy to wash and care for, but it was very elaborate and time-consuming to make. It takes many, many hundreds of bobbins to get to this density. But later it was adopted as part of Netherlands national costumes in the 19th century and continued to be produced for the Dutch market, even when it was no longer fashionable in the courts of Europe. Here's some more examples. These densely worked bobbin lace patterns were made of thousands of threads, as fine as a hair, and at a glance appear to be plain woven linen fabric, but are actually made up of elaborate and minute bobbin lace motifs. In the mid-17th century, a French woman named Françoise Badard came to Antwerp, just over the border in Valenciennes, to learn Flemish lace techniques. And upon her return to France, she founded an Ursuline convent in Valenciennes and directed the nuns to become a major competitive force in the lace-making industry. By this point, Flemish lace merchants were a major force in international trade and fought to remove the legal restrictions to operate more independently, which was granted by the city of Brussels in 1661. However, by 1665, the lack of legal protection in their booming trade came back to haunt the Flemish merchants, and they came to regret the lack of organization as their patterns were sent overseas and their workers were drawn to France. Although France had a number of small lace regions already in the late 16th and early 17th century, they did not have a lace industry on the scale of Flanders or Venice. Instead, they passed numerous sumptuary laws to try and stop their courtiers from spending all of their money on imported lace, but were unsuccessful. So eventually, the Minister of Commerce, 𝗂𝗶𝘀𝗀𝗃𝗃, pictured in the center, realized that no amount of legislation was going to stop people from buying this fancy foreign lace. So they decided, if we can't beat them, join them. In 1665, by the royal decree of Louis XIV, lacemakers were brought in from Venice and Flanders to set up French lace workshops in towns like Arras, Sedan, Argentan, and Alençon. And a shop was opened in Paris to sell the newly minted Point de France needle lace, which you see on the left. And this figure in real life is only about an inch, maybe an inch and a half tall. So very, very, very fine. By June 23rd of that year, Brussels lace merchants complained in a formal statement that the best lacemakers were leaving the city by the wagon load, bringing two great evils. The first loss is the finest and most profitable trade in all the first is the loss of the finest and most profitable trade in all the Low Countries. The second is that beneath this shadow of taking girls to work, several have been taken away and have been brought back with them genuine testimonies of public brothels, unquote. So unfortunately, it was used as trafficking. In response, Flemish cities issued strict protectionist orders, including one in Brussels in 1698 that said violators would be put in stocks and flogged. This is nothing compared to the Venetian Republic's response, which was basically to execute people. So if you took Venetian lace secrets with you to France. Unfortunately, the needle lace-focused Venetian Republic never fully recovered from the impact of the competing French needle lace industry, but the Flemish continued to innovate in bobbin lace techniques and thus remained at the pinnacle of fashion. By the early 18th century, the figural lace techniques first seen in the Albert and Isabella coverlet had been brought into new heights of ingenuity. Lacemaking continued to be a source of great wealth in convents, béguinages, and in family businesses. This detail of a wedding apron border depicts courting couples with elaborate detailed wigs and even their own three-dimensional lace trims. The woman on the right side is wearing a frilled lace headdress known as a frôlange or fontange that was very briefly fashionable between about 1690 and 1700. We don't get very many period movies of this era. I think The Favorite is like one of the only ones, but it's very bizarre looking. You can see a rare surviving example on the right worked in Point de France needle lace. Part lace, or bobbin lace worked in parts to create a limitless variety of designs, reached its pinnacle with 18th century Brussels lace, also named point d'Angleterre. It's not exactly clear why a Flemish lace is named after England, but it's possibly due to the fact that it was wildly popular in the English market and frequently even smuggled there. In 1678, a ship of Brussels lace was caught illegally, from Brussels was caught illegally smuggling lace to England. Containing over 744,953 ells of lace, as well as numerous accessories such as handkerchiefs and collars. And for reference, 1 ell is about 45 inches, so that's a lot of lace. At this time, the flax thread used to produce bobbin lace was as fine as a human hair, and Flanders was known not only for lace but for linen thread, which they exported to lace-making centers in France and Italy. The signature of Brussels lace is the droschel ground, which you can see magnified 14 times in the central image. It's made using 4 threads, which are braided together to join all of the motifs after they are created separately. The job of joining the motifs together was designated to the master lacemaker as it was the most challenging. This newly widespread method of working in parts allowed numerous bobbin lacemakers to work together on massive projects. So far, we have only seen lace accessories and not entire garments made of lace, due to the fact that lacemaking was so labor-intensive that full garments were out of reach for all but the wealthiest monarchs. One rare example of a full lace garment was the point d'Angleterre gown made for Empress Maria Theresa of Austria in the 1740s. Records vary, but it has been suggested that this gown was produced by lacemakers in Ghent to cover a debt the city owed to the Austrian Habsburgs, which they couldn't afford to pay. Dozens of lacemakers worked on the dress over 5 months, which was valued at over 25,000 guilders. It's impossible to accurately translate this historical currency, but I believe the Museum of Fashion and Lace in Brussels has estimated that this would be about €1,000,000 today, so very expensive. The Empress was painted wearing the gown twice, after which its whereabouts are unknown. Given its extreme value, it's likely that the lace was taken apart and distributed as royal gifts. This irregularly shaped fragment on the right is from the Met's collection and is believed to be part of the sleeve, given the large scale of the motifs, which resemble the painted dress. See the palm trees, like here. After the invention of lace machines, in the early 19th century, lacemaking continued to be an abundant source of national wealth to Belgium, and 1/4 of the whole population, 150,000 women, were said to be engaged in lacemaking in 1861. Contrary to beliefs that lacemaking is a lost or dead art, bobbin, needle, and numerous other lace techniques are still alive and well today, in pockets all over the globe. Despite machine innovations, many of these techniques can still only be produced by hand. And although lace is not a major industry anymore, it is practiced as an art form, and traditional Flemish techniques are still taught at Kant Centrum in Bruges, where I was lucky to study in 2015 and again in 2018. My hope for this lecture is not only to pique your interest in lace, but also to underscore the diverse and interesting history of women as artists, craftspeople, and entrepreneurs. As museums begin to shift their focus towards a more inclusive collecting practice, I hope to emphasize that museum storerooms, like the one I work in, are already full of work by women in the form of lace and other textiles. Although we will never be able to identify the names of the makers of individual pieces of lace, as that information was not recorded, we can still learn about the fascinating, beautiful, and difficult lives of women in history and uplift their stories in our galleries and publications. Thank you. So now we are going to open it up to questions.
If you have a question, I'll come around with the mic. Just feel free to raise your hand and I'll hand it over to you.
I don't so much have a question as I'm with the Dallas Lace Society and we're very glad to see you here.
Wonderful, thank you for coming.
Good afternoon. Can you speak a little bit more about the possible, I don't know if it existed, use of different types of lace together or joining lace, maybe bobbin lace by needle lace or whatever through the history?
That's a great question, and I didn't have time to get into that, but they definitely were paired together. So one of the reasons that it can be so hard to identify lace in those early portraits is because they would often use 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗃 with a bobbin lace edging instead of a needle lace edging. So they were often used together. And like I mentioned, Flanders and Venice, who were the major lace-making centers, both made both. They were just sort of known more for one than the other. But there are technical innovations that couldn't have really happened, perhaps, without the two techniques existing together. For example, one of the early forms of free needle lace after they got rid of the base was they actually laid down braids like in perpendicular directions as if they were the warp and weft of the linen, and they worked on top of those. So there was like braiding involved in early needle lace, and then in connecting together bobbin lace motifs, sometimes they would use like a needle and thread to do sewings. So there is like an overlap between them, even though they're technically quite different. And then later on you see, in the Victorian period, people loved to do like mixed laces and combine things together. And this supposedly started as like a way to avoid paying importing taxes when like wealthy New York ladies went to Europe to buy their antique lace, and they would sew it all together in a big, they're like, it's just a tablecloth, but it's actually, 10 pieces of rare lace or something. So it became sort of a fashion to have like mixed laces.
Thank you so much for this incredibly informative talk. I had a question about the conceptual origins of bobbin lace, because I was really taken by your, I don't know why I'm getting so much feedback. I was really taken by your description of the difficulty of relaying the concept of bobbin lace through print. Does that come from tapestry making? What are the origins of the technique?
So it's actually sort of a braiding technique. Someone described it to me once as cursive braiding. And I was like, yeah, that's kind of true. It's also been described as sort of like off-loom weaving. So if you're a weaver, you can imagine that basically all the warp and weft threads are independent. So they have the main stitch, the main stitches that are used are braiding and then cloth stitch, which is basically like plain weave. But what's nice is that you're not limited to the perpendicular warp and weft of the loom. Everything can change at any time. So the warp can become the weft and vice versa. So that allows you to create like an endless number of patterns. So it developed out of braiding, but I think I was gonna say something else and now I've lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. but it's kind of like, yeah, off loom weaving a little bit.
Great, thank you very much.
All right, I was going to ask, in the records, you showed a lot of, like in the early period, of the silk black work, and of course most of the lace we see is white, you mentioned, due to its wonderful preservation. Were other colors used in historical work, or did they pretty much stick to black and white?
That's also a great question. So yes, they absolutely use colors, and in fact, early bobbin lace tended to be often done in silk in different colors and in metal, because it's developing in tandem with passementerie, which are like decorative braids. So they were doing it, and it was sort of it started as like a surface ornamentation to cover seams. And then it just became increasingly elaborate. So early bobbin lace you'll see on the edge of like linen shirts. There's some in the Costume Institute at the Met from 16th century Italy where they have like the matching embroidery and bobbin lace together in the same materials, so like gold and silk colorful threads. And again, those just don't really survive that well. We have some of it. It's also hard to make. I didn't mention this, but Santa Teresa of Avila, who I mentioned briefly in her engraving from 1614, was actually responsible for founding some convents that specialized in a type of lace making in Spain in the 16th century that was polychrome, needle lace made with silk in different colors, and metal, and jewels. I mean, it's amazing, but it only really exists in these Spanish convent treasuries, so you don't see it anywhere else, which is a shame. But yes, lace was made in color. It just didn't really survive as well. Linen is so sturdy. I mean, there's a reason why we have 5,000-year-old Egyptian linen today. It's actually quite durable.
So something that you referenced at the beginning of your talk was that you have experience with a lot of other sort of fiber arts types of crafts. And I'm curious bobbin lace looks incredibly complicated. Did you find it to be a lot more difficult than other sort of more contemporary craft practices, or is it just less common?
Yeah, I think it's just harder to find, or was at the time. These days there's great classes online and all kinds of activities in lace making, but I think it was just harder to track down an instructor. But it looks intimidating, but it's one of those things where you start small and you take baby steps. And these days I would say needle lace is harder for me because I cannot for the life of me get the tension to be regular, but that's because I specialize in bobbin lace. So I think it looks intimidating, but like anything with practice, you can definitely learn it.
Could you talk a little bit about some of the health hazards that might be associated with this type of work? Was it only done by young people? Could they do it for a lifetime?
Yeah, so there's this sort of stereotypical image of lace makers all went blind by the time they were 30, and you hear that about like Chinese embroidery, the forbidden stitch, and it's sort of this dramatic thing that people use to I don't know, drum up interest in historical textiles maybe. But I think realistically, I mean, I'm 36 and it's getting hard to see. Like I got glasses last year, you know, like, so I think you sort of age out of it naturally. But at the same time, if you are so skilled in these things, if you've been doing them since you were 7 or 8 years old, you don't need to look at them that close. And one of the reasons they would pre-prick all their patterns, like make the pinholes, is so that you could just feel for them with your pin. You didn't have to look up close to see where you were going to place your pin. And you're using the patterns over and over again. So you get, I think you become really familiar with them. And there are even lace makers who are blind. So, you know, it isn't impossible to learn that. But I will say that the conditions, although better than agriculture, because you're working inside, could be pretty difficult. For example, spinners and lace makers that were working with flax needed a damp environment so that the threads didn't dry out. So they would often work in basements. And they also, many times you hear about the candle blocks, which are sort of these devices of these glass globes that would surround a single candle to project light beams onto individual pillows. And so you would have up to 16 lace makers using one candle. So it's definitely tough. It's not something that we do today, but I think it was, comparatively speaking, more comfortable of a choice.
I knew that you mentioned that there was black silk lace that was not as easily survived as the white ones, but I was curious if you knew of any paintings that we can look at that maybe show us examples maybe in the Met.
Yeah, you know, there aren't that many, and okay, there's a great one of Anne of Denmark that has black silk lace as her collar. And there's also, you know, when you read about historical lace, you read that, oh, they were starching it blue, they were starching it pink and dyeing it yellow with saffron, and you're like, where are these colorful laces? Like, they don't really survive. But I've read from a couple accounts of historians of like Elizabethan London that it was actually dealers and painters in the Victorian period, in some cases, did not think that colorful lace was as nice as white lace and would paint over them. So we don't actually have those depictions. But I don't know how true this is. I haven't analyzed these paintings exactly. But it does seem like people mostly chose to be painted in white lace. There's some William Larkin portraits of with yellowish lace, and that would have been very trendy for about 10 years in England.
Can you speak to the different styles of bobbin lace and how they were very focused in certain areas and kind of how that developed, to what time period that developed? It seems like every city that made it had a very specific style or technique.
Yeah, it's really difficult to sort of catalog and retrofit names on historical laces. So we often identify things by their names, even if they weren't always or exclusively made there. So Brussels lace is associated with Brussels, but there's a lot of lace made in Antwerp, but we don't have a lace called Antwerp lace. And there's a lace called Binche lace, which is another lace in Belgium, but it wasn't actually made in Binche. So it's sort of retrofitting. I think it's an issue for historians today to decide how we want to catalog things, because, you know, if something was made in a style, do we still call it that geographical region style even if it wasn't named for that? And then, of course, you know, like in Venice, Venice is a small island, not that many people can live on it, and so they outsourced a lot of their work to Dalmatia. So Croatia and Slovenia have 500-year lace histories supporting Venice. And they've developed their own individual styles, but it's sort of just like how language develops, where it's really hard to go backwards and pick it apart. But sort of like with regional dress and like folk dress in Europe and in different parts of the world, it was sort of cemented in like the late 19th, early 20th century, where now there's even like UNESCO protected, like this is the Croatian pattern, this is the style. But it's complicated. Yes, yeah, so the equipment does vary. The Flemish lace makers like to have a lot of bobbins, so they tend to be small. And they also tend to use flat pillows, which means if you're making lengths of lace, you actually, once you get down to the bottom of the pattern, you have to move the whole thing up physically, like unpin it and then move it up and repin it, which is terrifying when you have like 800 bobbins on your pillow, but that was their preference because they like to have the big round cookie pillows that you could spread your bobbins out on. Whereas in like Eastern Europe and Russia, they use these big round bolster pillows where your bobbins hang off of the pillow, which is good for tensioning, but it's good for working in the round. You can go around and around, but it's very frustrating to have lots of bobbins because they're hanging, so they kind of get mixed up a little, if that makes sense. But yes, there's regional tools, there's regional threads, there's, everything is you can get super minute in lace.
Hi, down here.
Oh, hello.
First of all, love your outfit, by the way.
Thank you.
And then second, it's kind of a two-part question, but how did you initially get into just lace? And then at what point were you like, wow, this is what I want to specialize in?
Yeah, it's one of those things where when I look backwards at my life, I'm like, oh, I was always headed here, but I just didn't know. Because already when I was, a kid, I was like, learned to crochet and embroider, and I made an installation in art school of all these crocheted doilies that I made, collected, and also inherited from my grandma's, which my art teacher hated, thought it was just awful, and wanted it to be ironic so bad. And I was like, it's not, I love doilies. And she was like, ugh. So nothing has changed. But at the time, I think I just didn't know that bobbin lace existed or needle lace. Like I didn't know that those were ways you could make lace because it just didn't have. Lace is everywhere, and there's tons of lace makers, but we don't have the best PR, I would say. So we're working on it. We're all online now. You can find us. But I think basically once I saw, this is true for many lace makers, once I saw and realized that, oh my gosh, people used to make this by hand, not just crochet, but other forms of lace making, I was like, that is for me. And then I flew to Slovenia to take a lace class, which they were like, why did you come here from New York? But I was like, I just wanted to come to your lace festival. And then after about like an inch, I was like, oh, I'm done. This is it. This is what I'm doing for the rest of my life. So that's sort of how I fell into it.
Cool, thank you.
Is lace specifically mentioned in sumptuary laws of some countries?
There's many sumptuary laws pertaining to lace. And for example, Queen Elizabeth, I usually put her in my lectures, but I was trying really to focus on Flanders here, but she sort of is known for these massive ruffs, like the most dramatic, and that was actually legally dictated. So she passed sumptuary legislation, like one in like 1583, and there's a bunch of them to basically make it so that people of different classes couldn't wear, it was determined the width of the lace you could wear was by like what class you were. And so there are cases of like, this Englishman out with his lace boot tops and someone working for the queen sees that they're too long for whatever his rank is, and so they would cut it off. But for the most part, people really didn't do it. But there's some really great history of sumptuary legislation in lace, like in France, it was under Louis XIII, they kept trying to ban it. So there's a poem that tells the story of sumptuary laws from the perspective of the lace itself, called the Revolt of the Passements. It's the revolt of the passementerie. You can find it online. It's very funny. And they're like, all the lace are crying and communing with each other that they're being forced out of France. But in real life, there were lace makers in France, like in 𝗟𝗶𝗀𝗵𝘁𝗂𝗀𝗏, which has a very long lace making history of bobbin lace, still made today. And they were destitute because they were this very small regional industry, but because the sort of French government or the court didn't recognize them, they were out of their income suddenly. So actually their patron saint of lace, Saint Régis, who was a Jesuit priest, went and argued on their behalf to change the law, and it was in fact changed. So now he's the saint of their cathedral in 𝗟𝗶𝗀𝗵𝘁𝗂𝗏.
Well, thank you all so much, and especially to Elena for coming out for such a fabulous talk. Thank you for spending your Saturday with us. And if you haven't seen the exhibition already, we've now extended it to October 15th, so please do go and see it. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.